First of all, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me once again here. Always such a pleasure to be at ZipCon. Such a great lineup of speakers, and as such, really honored to be here. So just before we begin, very short introduction about myself. My name is Kamil Bojarski. I'm currently working as a senior analyst in Standard Charter client, third party, and intelligence team, where we are dealing with threat intelligence related to intrusions against Standard Chartered vectors and customers. I'm also teaching assistance at Sense Institute, so if you will be taking 4578 Cyber Threat Intelligence course, you might meet me where I'm supporting students and instructor with learning during this week of 4578, and I'm a fellow at European Cyber Conflict Research Initiative, working and researching issues related to cybersecurity policy, law of armed conflicts in terms of cybersecurity, and various related aspects. Just a standard and short disclaimer, any views that I present here do not represent in any way official position of views of any of this institution or any institution I'm associated with. This is purely my own thoughts and conclusion on this subject. So let's get to it. We will start with a quote from Taylor Swift, who said that she always strives to be successful, not famous. And this is something that we will see during the presentation, because as we had many threat actors now being very famous, having their action figures, having the cool APT names and so on, what we will see is a shift in tactics that actually makes it quite difficult to attribute their activity to particular threat actor group activity cluster. But also, of course, it's got the advantages in terms of the evasiveness, in terms of concealing the activities. But we have to switch our musical gears here. Sadly, we will not be talking about Taylor Swift. We will be talking about the edge. So we will be talking about devices that are on the outside usually of the scope of usual desktop server workstation continuum, devices like routers, mail servers, firewalls, VPN concentrators, VPN gateways, also to a degree virtual machine hypervisor we will see, and especially if you are seeing the last bullet point and you are thinking what this means, what is it about, it's small office, home office routers. So for example, routers that you get from your ISP, and in many cases router that never gets updated with latest software, that got its management console somewhere, but the credentials are not changed, and so on. And as I'm coming from the also security monitoring trend hunting background, things that stood out to me immediately when I started thinking about the subject, about the list of those devices, is that there will be no EDR capability. I've been in few organizations when I have seen EDR being rolled out when it was quite new technology, and I think rightfully, to a degree, security community became very dependent, made very good use of this, having the live view of the process tree, seeing having some capability of memory analysis, being able to initiate live response and look up what the user is doing on their machine. It is all very useful, and in many cases makes it, maybe it doesn't stop the breaches, but it makes quite difficult for a threat actor to persist in the environment, or at least not leave any traces. This will not be the case here, and it is one of the many issues that we will have with those devices. We will deal with lack of visibility and response capabilities that are related to that lack of, for example, being able to have an agent to make some rapid command execution for forensic. The patching cycles that are not as codified, that are not as routine as, for example, Microsoft Patch Tuesday. Sometimes patches that do not fully address the issues. The number of inherent vulnerabilities in there. And of course, because we are talking about edge devices like routers, firewalls, there will be this need for external exposure in order for them to perform their activities. And this all translates into multiple offense opportunities. starting from the vulnerabilities, where the number of the potential exposure translates to capability for a threat actor to conduct mass scanning, mass exploitation, zero interaction exploitation. Now, of course, I do not want to name and shame any companies, but if we look just at the CVS that were issued this year, last few months, we have seen cycles related to vendors like Ivanti and FortiGate having to deal with the exposures, with the vulnerabilities that allowed remote code execution or privileges escalation. Once the threat actor is there, there will be this no need to worry about the EDR capabilities, about the live monitoring of the tools, and because they are that exposed externally, threat actors have pretty wide opportunity to scan those as long as they want to, as deep as they need to, in order to get this for the persistent foothold. So let's go through the history. Let's see how threat actors are abusing these exposures and capabilities. And for me, the history of when I became interested in this topic started late 2022, when there was conference in Washington, DC, Cyber WarCon. Sadly, I was not there in person, but I was watching a live stream, and there was a very nice presentation from colleagues from Mendiant, John Wolfram and Gabi Ronconi, and they were talking about GRU operations in Ukraine and describing the tradecraft, describing the kill chain that those threat groups were using. They coined the term living on the edge. So instead of attacking directly, trying to establish a foothold in the workstations, having some C2 reaching out from the desktop environment, they focused on edge devices, firewalls, router, email servers in this example, and they planted backdoors there, which allowed more persistent, as we will see, sometimes very long persistence in the environment, that decreased the bar for exploiting the vulnerability and needed complexity of attack, and allow them to conduct the operation in a very evasive manner. Now, when I started researching this subject, getting interested, I started thinking like, how far can we go back in time in terms of seeing the first traces of the activity? So when we look at the examples that are out there, in 2021, a French cybersecurity agency, ANSSI, published a dual report on the APT31 intrusion on the activity cluster, and they describe the tradecraft used, and they describe also the backdoor malware. And the aim of this malware was to create a peer-to-peer network of communicating small office, home office routers, especially the backdoor name refers to the package brands of the devices, and use this infrastructure as a command and control and anonymization networks. It was actually done in quite interesting, quite complex manner. There was the authentication based on TLS between peers. The devices compromised were divided into pools. So we had pools, I believe, around 10 devices that were communicating between each other and having this set C2 infrastructure for threat actor to use. And this was used for reconnaissance, communication with the victims, ultimately through this anonymization network and exfiltration of data. And this backdoor implant, according to ANSSI at least, was used since around 2019. As I saw in the report, ANSSI was basing it on the virus total submission. It consisted of 3 components. So it was ELF executable, the script launching the backdoor, and then configuration, which included list of the host, so that when the backdoor was installed on the device, it contained this configuration that allowed creating this pool of devices. And we had all this very nice diagram that showed more or less how it worked. So as you can see, APT31 was setting up pools of those devices, which were clusters and were used to ultimately communicate to the victim, issue commands, exfiltrate the data, and so on. So essentially adding a layer, creating this tiered structure of command and control infrastructure in order to make like multi-layer proxy and anonymized traffic, make it more difficult, more evasive to launch their attacks and to attribute their activity. Now, those are findings from the APT31 report from ANSI, but just a few months ago, this year, actually there was a United States Department of Justice indictment, always a very interesting, a very nice source of knowledge about activities, especially in terms of attribution and the description of all the findings that United States government have of their group. And the Department of Justice in the indictment described how this is related to China Nexus, Ministry of State Security. However, they also had the knowledge, they traced the activity actually back to 2015. So according to the indictment in the beginning in the 2015, started a campaign of phishing mails targeting United States government officials and their families. And the point of this phishing campaign was to basically profile fingerprint the devices that are used in their office, in their home office, in their home environment. And then we have this paragraph from the indictment. Then about between August and September 2018, conspirators, meaning here AP31, used those phishing emails to gain unauthorized access to the target's home routers and electronic devices. So as we combine this ANSI report and the additional information that was found down by the United States, we see that even if the infrastructure, if this backdoor implant was used, let's say 2019, the group had this in plan, was already compromising devices in 2018, certainly, and most likely going back to 2015 when the campaign started. So we are already, let's say, we are discovering this threat, we are addressing this threat, but it goes way back in terms of this cluster. Now, switching gears to the more Russia Nexus activity groups. In 2022, Mandiant reported on the activities of group UNC 3524, which was soon merged with APT29, so quite well-known Russia Nexus threat actor. And they described a very traditional, let's say, a very classical campaign of espionage. So the campaign aiming to exfiltrate mails from their victims. And how this was achieved, how the attackers were increasing their chances of success, was that they in fact started compromising the edge devices, of course. Now here Mandiant mentions the sun arrays, load balancers, wireless access, and in this context, in fact, this property that it is quite hard to secure the devices with EDR solutions. And when we look at the overview of this activity, what was happening there, the attackers, APT29 here, was using a quiet exit malware backdoor that was acting as an essentially SSH client-server pair. They were going even a bit further in terms of the edge infrastructure. So it was not only compromise of the edge infrastructure of the victims, but they also targeted IoT devices like IP cameras to establish a command and control server. In this SSH server and client part, this IP cameras serve as the servers and were able to issue and receive commands from the edge devices in the company infrastructure. Then also they moved along the other side of the spectrum. Beside compromising those very edge devices, so for example, the internet exposed external router, they were moving to compromise internal routers for a escalation of access in the environment, and also targeting the older versions of operating systems. So here again, coming back to the issue of having those patch cycles, of having the management of those devices adequate to the level of exposure. But if there is something that I would like the audience to remember from this slide, to point your attention, is that this last bullet point that I have not mentioned yet. I mean, the dwell time of those campaigns, of those exposure was up to 18 months. So a year and a half of the threat actor being able to establish this foothold in the environment and keep their activities going on in there. And if to have a meaningful comparison, I looked at the Mandiant Trends reports, M-Trends report for the same period approximately. And in 2022 Mandiant Trends report, we see that the average median dwell time dropped from 73 days to 28 days in 2022, which was a stellar improvement. So if this is a stellar improvement in terms of decrease of dwell time, going for a year and a half, so like 500 days, so how we'd call it probably like galaxy level decrease in effectiveness. This is something that's completely, if we were to show the statistics on a bell curve to statistics description of this dwell time in terms of various intrusion, the 18 months would be an absolute outlier in terms of how threat actors were able to persist, and it shows how this puts us in this a very different category of a threat that we are dealing with from the persistent perspective. Staying in around the year 2021, and around the time period when the reports were flowing, then we had advisory report from the United States Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, delivered together with FBI and NSA. And this was quite broad report. It described not a specific threat actor, not a specific tactic, but rather describe the scope of how China Nexus actors were achieving their objectives. CISA provided a very nice breakdown of the kill chain. And among those, we will be able to already see the traces of this kind of activity. So from the CISA report, the 3 highlighted tactics were related to resource development. So we have here use of revolving series of VPSs. So at this point, let's say quite standard procedure. It's quite often used to use various virtual servers, bulletproof hostings, and so on by the threat actors. Initial access, also nothing that out of ordinary, scanning target for vulnerabilities, exploiting that, and so on. And in command and control, we already see let's say, the first marks of how this was coming together. We had the use of VPS and small office, home office routers for operational infrastructure. So exactly what we are looking at, what we're aiming at. And if we go in depth into the report and we see what CISA meant by this use of those VPS compromised Soho routers, they exactly highlighted that the threat actors were creating multi-hop proxies. They were using it specifically to challenge attribution. They were able to leverage mass scanning of the facing infrastructure and web hosting. So we see the report does not provide timeline for those activities, so we could assume this is up to 2021. So if taking this into consideration, we see this, let's say, operational preparations so that we could see even from this very, very high level overview of the activities. And report also contains like the MITRE attack mapping out of the activities, and these edge related activities are basically at the beginning and at the end of the kill chain. So when we look at the top, we have the part about the weaponization, about setting up capabilities for the operation, acquiring infrastructure. And we specifically here we have mentioned about the use of VPS from cloud service providers and so on. So again, something very run-of-the-mill, notably in terms of the defensive tactics and techniques. CISA mentioned not applicable, which is to some degree reasonable. Of course, it's quite hard to detect, protect against just setting up capabilities, but we'll try to tackle that later on. But then at the end of the kill chain, in the command and control phase, we see exactly the tradecraft that we are talking about. So compromise of the small office, home office routers to create an infrastructure to evade detection, to recommendation to monitor traffic from this device, operating those nodes as a proxy infrastructure, and as such creating the anonymization network akin to Tor network. In terms of defense, CISA recommended to block the traffic from known C2 infrastructure, which of course is not easy at all, as Kuba had in his great opening keynote. The IOC block listing is kind of not very effective due to rotation of infrastructure and alerting on anonymity network. So we had this, let's say, starting from 2015 up to at least 21, we had multiple indications of threat actor being preparing to set up those command and control infrastructure in this way and then operationalizing it. So let's switch gears a bit now to the different technology, but the same time frame. So Mandiant reporting from 2024 described how the threat actors were using virtual machine hypervisors, here VMware ESXi and vCenter servers, to maintain persistence and escalate their operations in the environment by using the virtual machine hypervisors to issue command to the guest virtual machines. Here, the activity had quite a different scope than what we saw, but also talking about the virtual machine hypervisors, I mean, this tends to be a bit more complex, a bit more computing, powerful computing devices than routers, than firewalls. There is some expectation of the server. So I tried to look up what's the policy of the owner, VMware, now bought by Broadcom. So information from Broadcom on how to approach the securing of the VMware servers. And Broadcom notes that the antivirus malware detection appliances software is designed is needed on the general purpose computing environments where users can execute their code quite freely. And ESX is not a GP, it's not a general purpose computing environment. The antivirus malware detection services, as we see, are supported, but VMware does not recommend usage of third-party software, but focus on hardening. So, of course, this is not very useful. This is not much progress in terms of trying to add monitoring capabilities or having this live view. Let's go through the life cycle of the intrusion and what was the purpose here, and try to approach it from this manner. So the threat actors were using two vectors, virtual pipe and virtual pita, and here the activity was quite different because it was not used to establish an edge foothold, an external foothold from the compromised device. Instead, here, this was an internal foothold persistence mechanism in the environment. So these activities that we are describing here were done after the environment was compromised, after they were able to execute code on the hypervisors, and using the vSphere installation bundles, they were deploying those vectors, which then issued command on the guest host through VM-tool SD, so the VMware user process on the guest device. The kill chain here, because it was related, it was used as the second stage of intrusion, used multiple vulnerabilities, credential harvesting, for both getting access to the vCenter and then for issuing commands and execution of commands on the virtual machines. So we see here same approach, trying to target a device that is not covered by EDR, that might have limited monitoring capabilities, but taken in a very different manner, setting up this internal beachhead, trying to leverage the lack of monitoring for having this command execution capabilities in the network. And as we are approaching here 2022, this is where we are kind of getting back to the beginning of the presentation. So Mandiant reported in terms of the GRU activities in Ukraine that were supporting kinetic operation of Russian military, the playbook of how GRU was conducting their activities. And here they described it quite extensively, starting from the initial access and the initial operational preparations to the information operation component. But in fact, here the first the first step was this living on the edge. So in fact, we had this confirmation like that on cyber workon, we had this description of tactic on how it is used to further the goals, how it is used to enable persistence. Here we could see that Mendiant claims that from the analysis of the incident, we had actually confirmation that this is an ongoing process and part of a standard kill chain of those threat actors. So the GRU here, APT44, now the famous sandworm got its own APT number. We're targeting routers, firewalls, mail servers. They were targeting a commonly used technologies for scaling the efforts, so they could do mass scanning, mass exploitation, did not have to do much development in terms of exploits, in terms of building out new exploitation methods for the foothold. And again, it was used for external, let's say, foothold, so this edge infrastructure, but also internally after compromising the internal routers, and we had those kill chain of the edge device compromise to compromise of the server, having those primary access there in form of a web shell and circling back to compromising internal devices or performing operation from external router. Similarly, 2022, we had joint cybersecurity advisory from the multiple intelligence agencies, including some of you might recognize Polish military counterintelligence on the Russia Nexus actors using the compromised devices to facilitate cyber operation. And when we looked into the details, we see the exact issue we were talking about, targeting of edge routers shipped by ISPs, no firewall protection, no automatic firmware updates, default credentials, everything that makes it a prime target, makes it difficult to detect. So the last use case that we will mention is the quite latest one, quite interesting one. Fortunately, Michael Ruggie published this blog, so I'm able to use it. He presented this research at PivotCon conference. But then it was still under TLP Red, TLP Amber. But fortunately, we have this blog post, and we could talk about this very interesting concept of ORBs, so operational relay boxes, and how it impacts. Maybe IOC extinction is a bit clickbaity, but in fact, you will see that it might be the case, and it might further the how the block listing, how the atomic indicators are using its values. Operational relay boxes are kind of mix between botnet and Tor structure in terms of routing and passing the connection. They are the operational aspect refers to the fact that there might be many activity groups using the same infrastructure. So essentially, we have a separation from the hands-on operators and the creators of the infrastructure. Essentially, as you see in the last bullet point, weaponization is administered by third parties who are setting out this infrastructure, who are preparing infrastructure. Then the operator can log in, use this relay box in order to conduct their operation, to pass on the payloads, to have the commands issued, and so on. So in terms of how this is structured, there are essentially 4 layers, I would say. First, there we've got the adversary controlled servers, so the hands-on boxes, we might say. Then the least VPS servers that are controlled still by threat actors are hosted regionally, so in terms of the China Nexus around China-Hong Kong region. And then the third layer are actually either provisioned or compromised devices that follow on this schema of the ORB infrastructure with multiple interconnected nodes, and finally the one node that's reaching out to the victim. Now, probably describing this operation, I look a bit like this. So let's try to break it down in terms of differences between various infrastructure models used already.
So when we have a botnet, we have this still quite flat horizontal structure where we have operators who we have infected devices, and operators are logging into their fancy C2 consoles and can issue commands to the to, for example, DDoS attack a certain target. On the other hand, when we look at the Tor network, we have this vertical infrastructure, we might say. We have multiple nodes between the edge between the destination and the client, because this is of course mostly used not for attacking but for just internal browsing, for anonymization. So orb networks combine those approaches. And so we have here partially, we have this, let's say, C2 layer similar to botnet. We have those relay nodes that are hosted locally acting as this first layer. But then we have these traversal nodes, bit akin to the Tor network, that allows anonymization, and finally exit node reaching to the victim. And as such, the operators have more control over the infrastructure. The infrastructure can be separated from the relay nodes to a degree. So we have this compromised infrastructure that can rotate very quickly. That translates very much to ephemerality of the IOCs, on how it is difficult to track that infrastructure. And according to Michael Ruggi's research, the earliest example of those date back to 2016. So again, we had 2015 APT31 starting to dip into those. We had various China Nexus group at least since 2016 trying to leverage that approach. And we look at, if we look at the timelines, we can see that the activity started really going around the 2017-ish, 2018-ish, when we had this correlation on both China Nexus and Russia Nexus groups using similar approach, at least from the public reporting. That's what we could tell. And in terms of the popularity, let's say, of devices, or what is leverage for this compromise, we see a high affinity for routers. So we had this example with VMware, but generally the edge referred to the compromise of routers, compromise of firewalls, compromise again of routers, but small office, home office, and in that way creating the infrastructure. Okay, so that's how it looks. That's how these operations are conducted. So again, as we are defenders also here, it's up to us if this will continue, if this is gonna go forever, or if we would like to burn it down. In terms of the defense options, I believe they are on the spectrum of how much the activities, the defense options that we would like to take, address generally threat actor activity and would stop, for example, actions on objective phase regardless of the prepared infrastructure, to specifically hunting down and tracking down the related infrastructure. So at the top, we would have the hardening, we would have the protection from the data leaks that serves to stop the threat actor activity, even if there is compromise. Then we have addressing technologies that are especially exploited by threat actors, and then we had more on the side of addressing this technique itself, monitoring for anomalies in traffic between the infrastructure and devices, and of course infrastructure traffic. When we take a look at the approach, for example, that was proposed by Mendiant, and how these exploited this quiet exit SSH server client malware was using, the ultimate goal was exfiltration of emails, so the espionage operations. And in fact, Mendiant themselves are quite clear about the fact that it's not easy to remediate those devices. It's not easy to have live visibility. So we can have this remediation done on the level of the ultimate target, here being the email system. And by hardening those, by monitoring by pushing focus of our defense efforts, where in fact have much visibility into logs, we have visibility into user actions, trying to stop and interdict the activity there. The layer below that would be focusing on the specific technology. So when we had this example of VMware compromise, the ESXi devices that were compromised, there is much that can be done here. Of course, though, it will be more more effort intense in terms of focusing measures. So we could do logging and hardening in terms of installation of those vSphere installation bundles. We could set an acceptance level, so basically a safeguard against installing untrusted bundles. We could check the bundles against the known good list and so on. But of course, I mean, it's easy to say it in the hindsight. In the reality, it's we would have to have a very extensive security program to apply this kind of hardening, this kind of maybe even forensics without evidences of compromise for checking the integrity of images without earlier notification. So where this can come from is essentially on the edge, again, between the infrastructure that we use in workspaces and the infrastructure that's compromised by this manner. So network security monitoring. After all, even if we have the compromised router in our environment, if we have compromised firewall device, to achieve objectives, they will have to communicate back to devices in our infrastructure, and we could try to look there. We could try to look at anomalies just from statistical level. Especially as we saw those devices are used for exfiltration, we could look at volume anomalies, for example, management interface of a firewall or for a device that does not really do much data transfer suddenly being poured out. The SSH over unusual ports, as we will see, is quite commonly seen, and by that monitoring what's happening there and trying to trace back to compromised devices. And of course, let's say the layer that's addressing the tactic itself, so those clusters of compromised devices, is infrastructure tracking. As you remember the CISA suggestion about defense, we have here use network allow and block listing to block traffic. Of course, this is easier said than done, but let's try to do this a bit, and let's try to pivot the indicators that we had. Now, for the infrastructure trafficking, the usual approach, the approach that I also very much like, is profiling the communication patterns using the certificates and so on. But here there will be a few more data points that I think are worth considering and that I would like to share with you. So first of all, if we start from this very top layer, or from most straightforward actions, CISA was also referring to the non-standard port use, and from my experience, in fact, this is something that's quite often done by those threat actors. So use of services as SSH on the ports, for example, above 10,000, trying to mix use of ports, but in a quite repeatable and human memorable manner. So adding, for example, 1,000 to the port and so on is one idea on the tracking. In terms of particular examples, I based, for example, here on great research by Lumen, Black Lotus Labs. They very kindly provided a infrastructure data on infrastructure activity related to KV botnet and compromising C2 routers. So if we looked at the temporal patterns, if we look at activity of those devices, we could first start to see what were the types. So what were the most affected brands. Here, once again, we see, as you see on the bottom, the IP cameras, so mix of those very common Cisco Netgear devices and IoT devices. And then when I started researching particular compromised assets, the very common denominator was use of quite peculiar certificates. So here, for example, we had the example of the TLS certificate with organization string, this email address, bbc@bbc.com. Of course, this was not a BBC certificate. And when we look at the activity further down various devices, we saw that while those certificate common names, organization units are not maybe following very memorable pattern, but they are quite clearly done on the basis of cut run over the keyboard strings or very short strings of the characters that are near each other on the keyboard and so on. And if we go back to the research on APT31, we saw that this is something that was already also noticed by ANSI, who was listing those common names in their profile of the infrastructure. One more aspect to consider here is the device hardware. So as we discussed, this affects this mainly small office home or office routers that might not have the best and greatest security posture in terms of vulnerabilities. So looking, for example, at this research done by Cisco Talos, the researchers look at the vulnerabilities in small office home office routers. So I thought this was an idea to add an additional data point and try to profile by device type. Now the issue here is that as they look at those devices, the vulnerabilities are spread across very high number of vendors and high number of various devices. So unfortunately, that's what threat actors are also using, is that this issue is prevalent. But ultimately, as I'm a great fan of infrastructure traffic, this is something that is still quite valuable in terms of detecting and tracking the infrastructure. I always recommend creating this kind of pivoting tables and creating a composite object of the infrastructure. So for example, here for this KV botnet related to Volt Typhoon activity, we had quite a few of those data points like the certificate common names or the ASN used or the JARM hashes that were repeating. So there is still possibility to track those down that way. And depending on what kind of visibility we have, perhaps adding this hardware mapping to track down what is going on in terms of exploitation efforts. So that is all from my side. Thank you very much. I hope you found the presentation useful.